そもそもさ、ワインでございますって面か俺たち。あ、うまい。
I view films as sort of storytelling, time-traveling, cultural ambassadors. I know that sounds a bit odd, but films do and show a lot of things outside of just general storytelling. They can represent the times they were made in, the places they were filmed in, and give a small bit of insight into the cultural atmosphere at the time of production, as well as a glimpse at what the values of those that crafted the film were. To cut down on the rambling and to put a TLDR here, while film is sort of an international language, it is largely formed by the culture of the people that made it, as well as the time they were produced in. Which is why adaptations and remakes of international media are so very interesting, at least to moi. When bringing over a story to a new nation and making it more palatable to a new audience, what does one bring over and what do you change? Do you make it a shot-for-shot remake and change as little as possible, or do you just keep the skeleton and change everything else? And this is decided upon by multiple different factors. Staff working on the adaptations, like the directors, writers, to even the production companies funding the project, to even just the current cultural norms of the nation it's being made in or by. Now, I'm an American, born and raised in Southern California, and the US is sort of infamous for its adaptations of foreign material, and that's somewhat fair, as there's a lot of underwhelming remakes and adaptations out there, but I believe that that's more of a byproduct of basically being the film production capital of the world, rather than Americans being shit at adapting foreign films in general. Trust me, just because you're born and raised in a place doesn't make you bad at making movies. However, greedy production companies out to make a quick buck certainly don't help, especially if they don't give a shit about the source material itself. Spike Lee is, in my opinion, a great filmmaker with a lot of solid works under his belt, but his adaptation of the Korean film Oldboy, which itself is a adaptation of a Japanese manga, is pretty not good. And if you watch the interviews with him surrounding the film's release, he sounds like he couldn't have been less interested. But on the flip side of things, if a director has enough skill as well as passion, they can turn out something really solid, or something that can even eclipse the source material, like Martin Scorsese's remake of the Hong Kong film Infernal Affairs with The Departed. So, with this little series I'm doing, I want to take a look at some remakes and adaptations, but with a bit of a twist. I'm going to examine international adaptations of American media, be it film, television, and so on and so forth, because I generally don't really hear about this sort of thing all that much. Plus, as an American, I have a bit more insight into the cultural aspects of the source material, and I can see how it was changed, translated, or even removed for their foreign counterparts. And in this particular video, I'm going to be examining a Japanese remake of an aughts classic, Saidoweizu. And to do that, we first need to explore how it came to be. Film is art, and art is a living thing. And just like any living thing, it adapts to new environments. But sometimes, the environments adapt to it. Now, Asia is no stranger to film. They've been producing cinematic classics for as long as we have. Though, for a very long time, our audiences and markets have largely been separate from one another. It was rare for an Asian film to ever really make it to the US, and even rarer for them to grab the attention of mainstream audiences in the West. Usually, the only way for Asian stories to really be told here was if they were remade and repackaged as Westerns, largely due to, if we're being honest, the xenophobia of the mainstream audience at the time. Much in the same way songs by African American artists were redone and resung by white musicians. American films also never really saw any major returns in Asia as well. However, times have changed, and over the course of a few decades and a lot of reforms, post-war East Asian dictatorships like China, Taiwan, and South Korea not only liberalized, but became economic powerhouses. And as the countries opened up, so too did their feeders. In the 2003 article, The Asian Factor in Global Hollywood for Yale Global Online, Christina Klein states,
Historically, Asian markets have not been very significant for Hollywood, insofar as they have not generated anywhere near as much revenue for the studios as have European and Latin American markets. This began to change in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s. Today, Hollywood movies take about 96% of the box office receipts in Taiwan, about 78% in Thailand, and about 65% in Japan, which has become Hollywood's biggest single most profitable export market. Today, the average studio production earns well over 50% of its revenue abroad. That number is expected to grow over time, with some industry figures predicting the foreign share of box office earnings could rise to 80% within the next 20 years. This means that Hollywood is becoming an export industry, making movies primarily for people who live outside of the United States.
Of course, this sort of cinematic mass cross-cultural exchange wasn't entirely one-sided. Even with films produced here in America, we can really see the influence Asian cinema has had in Western media. Nearly 20 years on from Klein's article, and we live in a world where an East Asian film can win an Academy Award for Best Picture. Asian cinema has never been as visible or as accessible to the mainstream audiences as it is now. This sort of sets up the foundations of how the Japanese adaptation of Sideways came to be. By 2009, Hollywood really understood the importance of catering to Asian markets, and in doing so, not only were larger budget films being designed and crafted to be more palatable for foreign markets, but some domestic American films were being remade by American studios in Asian countries. In the New York Times article, Sideways Returns, Uncorked for Japan, which has been a really helpful resource for shaping this video and understanding the film's production, Eric Capel states,
United States studios have taken the phrase, think globally, act locally to heart. Nearly every studio has set up an international operation for producing and distributing original movies made in local languages. Now, a handful of those studios are scouring their catalogs, seeking films, box office smashers, and middling performers alike to remake for new audiences.
One of these films from the backlogs that was picked to get the international remake treatment was, of course, Sideways, a film that did incredibly well at the box office, making nearly 7 times its own budget back in sales, and winning an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, along with being nominated for several others. However, the news of this Japanese remake garnered little more than a huh in terms of reactions. Even the original director of Sideways, Alexander Payne, sounded little more than mildly amused. In the same New York Times article, Payne remarked in an interview,
I don't know a damn thing about it, but I hope it's better than the original. No, I'm really delighted. I got a check for it, and the check cleared.
This new film would be handled by Selin Gluck, a Japanese-American producer and general second-unit director for films made both here in America and in his birth country of Japan. This was, and seemingly still is, his only time being a full director of an entire film. The film's screenplay would be written by Usugi Takayuki, who has apparently done nothing before and after this film, which is a good indicator of things to come. Though Rex Pickett, the writer of the original novel that Sideways is based on, and Alexander Payne were also credited despite not actually working on the film directly. And so, half a decade after the original hit feeders, the Japanese-American co-production of Saidoweizu was finally released. Before I get into the comparison aspect of this video, I feel a brief synopsis of the original plot is in order. So, in a very condensed nutshell, Sideways follows a depressed, somewhat recently divorced middle school teacher aspiring to be a novelist named Miles Raymond, played by Paul Giamatti, and a soon-to-be married friend and B-grade TV actor Jack Cole, played by Thomas Hayden Church, who are having an extended bachelor party in Santa Barbara a week before Jack's wedding. Unbeknownst to Miles, though, Jack is hijacking this wine-tasting and golf-putting vacation to hook up with any woman that will reciprocate his advances. Miles, while upset with this change of plan, doesn't do much to stop his old college roommate from doing just that. Miles even manages to get roped along with him during a double date, which involves Stephanie, played by Sandra Oh, who's a wine pourer slash saleswoman that Jack took an interest in after one of their early excursions to the surrounding wineries, and Maya, played by Virginia Madison, who's a waitress at a hitching post steakhouse that Miles is somewhat acquainted with and seemingly shows some, albeit hesitant, interest in. Despite his reluctance and increasing irritability with Jack's antics, the relationship Miles and Maya share starts to grow into something more, and progressively, Miles shifts away from being the sort of Weasley, neurotic walking mess that he was at the start of the film into the person he probably was before his messy divorce, or just someone he'd much rather be. So, this is just a brief summation of the basic plot of the film, and on the surface, it seems pretty simple, which it kind of is. Yet, to call the film shallow in any sense would be a gross misinterpretation of what Sideways is. Sure, if you read a synopsis of the plot, it might not sound all that special, but films aren't just cliff notes. The real strength and humanizing aspect of Sideways is not the cinematography or the music, which are both solid, don't get me wrong, but rather it's the actions and interactions of the characters, which in turn are carried by some excellent performances by all four of the film's main cast. The scene in which Miles opens up to Maya using Pinot Noir as a stand-in for himself is honestly a fantastic piece of acting. It's self-reflection that's organic, non-forced, and done in a way that only Miles could do, but I'll touch up more on the characters a bit later. It's these minor aspects of the film that work in conjunction with one another to craft this, in my opinion, modern classic, or as modern as a 17-year-old film can be. And I place emphasis on the smaller things, because Saidoweizu is largely faithful to at least the major story beats of the original. Saidoweizu follows Michio Saito, played by Fumio Kohinata, a screenplay writer who's down on his luck after recently breaking up with his girlfriend after the relationship became stagnant. He's come to Los Angeles, yes, this film takes place in California again, to meet up with his old college roommate and former TV actor Daisuke Uehara, played by Katsuhisa Namase, to go on an extended bachelor party before getting married. Daisuke wants to go to Vegas, but after slipping up in front of his soon-to-be in-laws, Michio convinces him to go to the vineyards of Napa Valley, not Santa Barbara for some reason. Despite this, Daisuke still plans to use his vacation to go wild and have sex with any woman that gives him a second glance. When they arrive at their destination, they bump into a familiar face, Mayuko Tanaka, played by Kyoka Suzuki, who Michio tutored way back when, and her young Japanese-American friend, Mina Parker, played by Rinko Kikuchi, who you might recognize from Pacific Rim, who Daisuke takes a vested interest in. As Daisuke and Parker go off bonking one another, Michio and Mayuko reconnect, and a relationship starts to form between the two. So, yeah, this all sounds sort of familiar, and Saidoweizu goes out of its way to mimic most of the classic scenes from the original. But it's how Saidoweizu adapts and translates these iconic moments, and especially all the little minor aspects in between those, see that callback to a few paragraphs ago, that makes it a dry and honestly lesser experience than the film it's adapting. So, let's explore why that is. But first, I want to state that despite some of my more questionable takes in previous videos, and more notably on Twitter, that I'm not really a fan of being hypercritical or hyperbolic when criticizing a piece of media. Acting petty or snarky without attempting to understand or learn from, or even engage with art might make for good comedy, though I'd be lying if I said most YouTube critics were all that funny. It's not necessarily conducive to good, constructive criticism, and rarely adds anything of real worth to the conversation. So, this upcoming portion of the video might come off as a bit negative, but I think it's also important to learn how an adaptation can be mishandled in a way that dampens the overall product, at least when comparing it to the original. That being said, I want to state here and now that Saidoweizu is by no means a terrible film. By itself, it's pretty forgettable, but nothing that warrants a 40-minute impassioned rant interspersed with terrible cutaways and snarky jabs. The film is composed of solid actors who have done, and have gone on to do, a lot of work outside of this adaptation, so I don't think their acting skills are at fault here. Rather, I think the one-note performances here are due to largely a vanilla script more than the cast being bad at what they do. With all that said, and it was a lot, and sorry about that, I want to first examine how these films differ on a sort of fundamental level, despite the remake trying to imitate many of the scenes that made Sideways, well, Sideways. And I don't think there's a better way to illustrate the half-heartedness of Saidoweizu as an adaptation than by comparing the two films' openings. I'm sure everyone has heard the old adage of show don't tell when it comes to presenting a story, and Sideways follows this methodology closely. What you see is generally what you get, and the context clues the film provides allows you to infer more about the characters rather than it being directly spelled out for you. The intro of Sideways does this perfectly. The first 3 minutes establishes Miles as a character just by having him go about his usual business in his home environment. When you compare how dingy, unkempt, dark, and overall Miles' place is, with his mountains of books and paperwork stacked all around the apartment, with his more passive and well-spoken demeanor when talking to others, we can almost instantly infer on a subconscious level that Miles is a lot like his apartment, filled with knowledge but worse for wear. It's diegetic environmental storytelling done right. In contrast to this, Saidoweizu gives us Michio sitting at an airport, giving us a monotone monologue, telling us about why he's in America, who Daisuke is to him, why his girlfriend left him, what his occupation is, and all that jazz. All of this info is just unloaded onto the audience in just 3 minutes. This is something the original takes upwards of an hour to establish, done primarily to give them a sense of weight and gravity, all the while feeling natural. I'm not going to pretend that monologues are lazy storytelling or can't work. That'd be stupid. But when done in this fashion, you can see that Saidoweizu wants to have its cake and eat it too, by having all the famous scenes of Sideways without putting in the work to make them, well, work. And this sorta, screw it, sort of methodology carries on throughout the rest of the film. As stated before, just about every really notable scene in Sideways has been redone in Saidoweizu, but their adaptation often comes out as underwhelming and, for a lack of a better word, neutered. The brief pit stop at Miles' mother's house is here, though in this case she is the mother of a friend they used to crash with who recently passed away. The scene in the original served to illustrate that Miles isn't the best person around, and despite being fed up with his friend's bullshit, he is willing to do equally scummy things, like rob from his own mother. In the remake, however, the scene is crowbarred in as a means to get the duo in a car that looks similar to the car from the original because of, I assume, brand recognition. The Pinot Noir monologue is here, but instead of being the slow, semi-awkward moment of self-realization by Miles in an intimate, quiet conversation with Maya that he ultimately squanders, it's sort of a brief chat between Michio and Mayuko in the middle of a party to get to know each other. The liar revealed scene is here, but instead of being an oh shit slip of the tongue moment, the film feels the need to remind you of the MacGuffin that reveals said liar every now and again. The scene with Miles/Michio's friend getting their, face kicked in is presented without much of the tense, albeit comical violence. The wallet scene is here without any of the nudity. In fact, there's no on-screen sex at all in this film, which I believe is more to appeal to the more conservative general audiences of Japan, but it would also be a bid by the studio to reach a bit broader in terms of audience with a lower age rating. And the car crash scene is also here without any of the funny. Even the famous breakdown scene involving the spittoon makes an appearance here, but it feels forced in the same way the car scene was. In fact, all these scenes do. The gotta meet that quota vibe is present throughout this entire production, and extends to the characters too. The gang's all here, sure, but they're just kind of like 2D half-baked copies of the source material, with much of the complexity siphoned out. Michio is just a guy down on his luck, largely through no fault of his own, aside from his slight hesitancy and occasionally not thinking things through. Although he can be reserved, he seems to have no problem being sociable when he needs to be. Miles, on the other hand, seems to wallow in his misery, and actively fights to stay within it. He's wormy and borderline loathsome, and he's generally the cause of all of his problems, like how he cheated on his wife, and yet still has the nerve to be upset when she gets married to another man. For as much of a narcissistic schmuck as Jack is, he's basically Miles' only real friend and connection to the rest of the world. If it weren't for Jack dragging Miles around with him during his little escapades, for selfish reasons of course, Miles, being the insular person that he is, would probably shut himself off from the rest of the world for good. Yet, despite all of this, we want to see him happy, and even get the girl, which is quite the feat considering all his negative traits. And that's because the film makes Miles feel real and genuine. The audience knows that behind the neurotic, miserable exterior, there's a good guy in there. And all that depth is just kind of absent in Saidoweizu, and all the supporting characters are sadly just kind of dull. And I could go more into that, talking about how Daisuke is just kind of a jerk with no real personality, whereas Jack is also a jerk, but extremely likable and one that uses his charisma to get his way, which ends up biting him in the ass. But this is becoming really redundant, and I believe I've already illustrated my point. Going on would just be ranting for the sake of ranting, so I think it's about time to wrap this up. I feel it's important to reiterate that, once again, Saidoweizu isn't an awful movie, but it's one that will forever live in the shadow of the original. But every movie, be they good or bad, can teach the viewer something and impart a lesson that may not be in the text itself, but surrounding it. Saidoweizu is not quite the cultural study I thought it was going to be when I first started brainstorming this video, at least not in the way I was expecting. Rather than being a showcase for how the Japanese would adapt an American film, what I walked away with was seeing Saidoweizu as a sort of history lesson. It's a glimpse into a specific period of time where Hollywood collectively wanted to export its classics again by remaking and redoing its backlogs themselves, much like they did in the 1930s with their old catalog of horror films, such as Dracula. This isn't something that's done much at all these days, because it's really not where the money is. Today, Hollywood just makes its biggest domestic films appealable to anyone anywhere. It's why superhero films are so popular not only here in America, but also abroad in places like Asia. You don't want to invest in a huge project that won't sell to the other bigger markets out there, would you? There's at least the possibility of profit when it comes to remaking foreign films for American audiences. We have one of the biggest film markets in the world, and folks here are repelled by subtitles. I mean, even some of the worst offenders can make some cash. And in the eyes of the big budget film industry, remaking something is easy. The blueprint is already there. But when Hollywood tried to think globally, act locally by remaking its films for audiences abroad, they didn't really capture them. Not in the same way TV had, at least, which I will discuss in another part of the series, wink wink, nudge nudge. And so, they abandoned this little experiment pretty quickly, leaving films like Saidoweizu as a sort of cinematic reminder of a thing that just kind of happened. Saidoweizu is not a case of a film being incompatible for a new audience. If given the attention and effort it really deserved, I'm sure it would have been just as good as the original. Instead, the film is an example of what happens when a studio doesn't know what it has, and tries to make a quick buck on trying to recapture something they never truly got it all.